Verbal agreements. They happen all the time in business and personal life. But how long are they actually valid? And when can they be legally enforced? These questions aren't just academic. They could determine whether your handshake deal is worth anything in court. Oral contracts are verbal agreements between parties, as opposed to written contracts. While many people assume verbal agreements aren't legally binding, they often can be, with important limitations. The challenge isn't usually whether they're valid, but whether you can prove their existence and terms. Every state has specific time limits, called statutes of limitations, that determine how long you have to file a lawsuit for breach of contract. For oral agreements, these periods typically range from 2 to 6 years, depending on your state. California, for example, allows just 2 years to file a claim based on a verbal agreement, while New York provides a more generous 6-year window. Written contracts generally have longer limitation periods than oral ones, sometimes extending to 15 years. This difference reflects the inherent challenges in proving the terms of verbal agreements as time passes. The clock on these time limits starts ticking when the breach occurs, or when a reasonable person should have discovered it, not when you actually became aware of the problem. The statute of limitations exists for several practical reasons. It prevents delayed lawsuits from emerging years after issues arise, when witnesses' memories have faded and records may have been destroyed. It also provides certainty by putting a definite end date to potential litigation. Beyond time limitations, certain agreements face another hurdle, called the statute of frauds. This legal doctrine requires specific types of contracts to be in writing to be enforceable. These typically include contracts involving real estate sales, agreements that cannot be completed within 1 year, and in many states, sales of goods over $500. The statute of frauds doesn't determine whether a contract is valid. It simply provides an affirmative defense in court. A defendant can argue that even if all elements of a contract exist, the agreement isn't enforceable because it should have been in writing. However, several exceptions can allow oral contracts to be enforced despite the statute of frauds. Partial performance is one such exception. If one party has already fulfilled part of their obligations, courts may uphold the agreement. Promissory estoppel is another. If someone reasonably relied on the verbal agreement to their detriment, courts may enforce it to prevent injustice. Additionally, if a defendant admits in court that an oral contract existed, a judge might uphold it despite the lack of documentation. Proving the existence of an oral contract presents significant challenges. Courts typically look for supporting evidence, such as witness testimony from people present during discussions, written communications like emails or text messages that reference the agreement, and actions taken by both parties that suggest a contract was in place. For example, if services were provided and payments were made, these actions support the existence of an agreement. The validity of verbal agreements is also affected by several key factors. These include available evidence, credible witnesses, whether parties relied on the agreement, and the type of contract in question. Common disputes involving verbal contracts often arise in employment agreements, service contracts, and sales transactions. To summarize, verbal agreements can be legally binding, but they come with significant limitations. Their enforceability is governed by state-specific statutes of limitations, typically ranging from 2 to 6 years. Certain types of contracts must be in writing under the statute of frauds, though exceptions exist. The biggest challenge with verbal agreements isn't their legal status, but proving their existence and terms in court. If you're facing a dispute involving a verbal agreement, consulting with a qualified attorney who understands your state's specific laws is the best way to determine whether your claim is still within the applicable time limits, and what evidence you'll need to support your case.